Hello, this is Spicy Dungeoneer, and welcome to my look into the new character races for the upcoming One D&D. I think this is going to be interesting. It's a huge topic, so let's get into it. You might be curious about what is going to be happening in the future of D&D. The publishers have basically released this idea of One D&D, and it's going to be coming up in this year. It's supposed to have a lot of fresh new ideas, but it's supposed to also be compatible to old D&D. So they're trying to get away from this idea of like a sixth edition. Uh, they're going. I don't see them making a lot of changes to the rules, and that's kind of a little bit disappointing because, except for the fourth edition, I thought every book has been interesting in its own way. Not that I don't love to go back and play a first edition D&D game every now and again, just for simplicity's sake. But fifth edition definitely became much more popular than it has been. I think also Wizards of the Coast learnt their lesson from fourth edition because uh, going back to third edition when they had to update it to 3.5, and then fourth edition was much less popular, and for me the reason was because it was like a computer game, that it opened the door for things like Pathfinder and stuff like that to just say, oh, we reject fourth edition, we're going back to third edition. And so Wizards of the Coast had to respond to that. And basically, that I think that is why they're not going to make a lot of big changes. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't have any sort of private information or secret information. We'll see how we go. But I think it's going to be interesting, and there will be a few little tweaks, such as with new rules about inspiration and just ways that things have been done. There's been a lot of what we call splat books, which are just expansions, and there's been a power creep due to those splat groups, splat books, and I think that then this will be like going backwards a little bit in some ways, but of course we all know that after the new rules will come up, they will actually re-release more books, and we'll get this power creep as well continuing. And I would also say there's a sort of a magical creep. So these days everything's got some magic, and you can see how when they're creating these new rules that a lot of the races do have magical ability. One of the things I find interesting is that they want to get away from the use of race and replace it with species. I can completely understand them getting rid of the word race because of all the problems associated with it. I don't think species is the right word because that sounds like some sort of science fiction thing. I think that they should just use lineage, which they do use as their subrace, but so they have species and lineages. Lineages would be subraces like elves and dark elves, high elves, wood elves, right? But is they are still subraces, and yet they've sort of changed this so that creatures like dwarves and halflings don't get subraces or lineages, but some do. There's some new ones for tieflings, for example. Also, this idea about that the race or the lineage does not affect your ability scores. instead your background will. I can understand why they might do that, because you don't want to say... The problem is, when people start applying this game to real life and looking at how it can be viewed as discriminatory in real life, and that there's some very good points to that. I just wonder whether it's going to be the best way to do this. I don't know. I think it's reasonable to say that, like, a ogre is naturally stronger than a pixie, but when it comes down to, okay, this orc, are they less intelligent than a human, and what are there problems with that? I don't know. So yeah, I see where they're going, and I think it's good for the game. It'll be interesting to see how the backgrounds are used. I think there's a lot of interesting things, like, for example, the language is a good example. So you're not born knowing a language, that's true, except if you're a half dragon, or dragonborn. So they get dragon as a language. You could also argue that the gnomes who get speak with animals are getting a language because of their race. So that's kind of interesting. I think I would like to see languages tied to intelligence scores again, like they used to be. I would like to see some, like, I completely understand, because I have some experience teaching languages, that most of the world speaks more than one language. It's just English speakers who get a bit lazy with this, because English is so widely used, and are more often to only speak one language. But data shows that statistically most people speak 2 or 3 languages. And I think if you add, like, a sort of trade common language, that you may not be able to talk about politics, but you'll still be able to buy stuff from the shop, that could be an interesting language to add. I always like that about Oriental D&D, that trade language. Anyway, so as I mentioned, sub-races have been eliminated. Or have they? Because we still have lineages, and they exist for all intents, because these things are very popular. The drow are a very popular race. They're not going to get rid of them because they make so much money. I find it interesting that all races have a 30-foot movement speed. So basically, I get it, they don't want to discriminate against people, but I do think it's not quite realistic. They're quite willing for creatures like wood elves to have a 35-foot movement speed, but nobody gets less than 30 feet. And I wonder if this is sort of this growing trend of, there's no negatives to any of these things, that there's no cost to pay. I would actually think that a few flaws might be interesting to add there, add something for role playing. 5 foot of movement, I get it, it is big, but it's nothing that some magical boots or some other sort of spell couldn't help in the future. It gives your character something to work towards. This other idea of getting rid of, like, half races, I understand why they did it. It makes sense. If they're talking about changing race to species, though, that has some interesting biological arguments against are they really species if they can have viable offspring together. Yeah, best not to get into that too much. But you know, we can't have half orcs, we can't have half elves, but we can have tieflings, we can have dragonborn. So it's sort of like some things are out, but other things haven't been mentioned yet. And so orcs are going to replace half orcs. That's fine. If you do want to be a half elf or a half orc, you just use either the parents' stats. So half elf, you probably use elf. Humans are, you know, haven't changed that much. If you're familiar with the variant human, you probably know most of the changes. They can be small now, which is interesting and actually fits in. There's plenty of smaller people. And they get their proficiencies and a free feat like always. I think everybody now gets a free feat, but humans now get 2. So this is another example of power creep where everybody wanted this one free feat, and so you can't take things away from the humans without giving them something back, so they're going to have to get this extra feat. I would argue that giving small characters the 30-foot movement also takes stuff away from humans. Humans, you don't see humans being changed and given dark vision like most of the other species. So these are some interesting things. I think this idea about inspiration will be interesting, and it's good that they're getting a game mechanic to put that in. It's all about dice control, and I think it'll be a good way to get people interested in a new kind of rule. But I must admit, they could have. This rule was very minimal, and they're really just building on a rule that already existed but wasn't being used to its full potential. Dragonborns. I would like to have seen more with this. I do like this species. I would like to see them look a little bit more human, sort of more like a UNT, right? Or at least have that option to be able to do that. But anyway, their breath weapon has become more standardized, which is sort of going back the way it used to be, which I'm actually fine for, even though people might complain about that, thinking that it's a nerf. They get dark vision just like just about everybody else, except for humans, and they get that language that apparently Draconic is so magical that you can just be born with it, but not Elvish. Dwarves are interesting. They've sort of, some people have argued that the mountain dwarf is one of the most powerful races in the game at the moment, and this basically nerfs them, although they're still a good race. I like the idea of tremor sense. It's quite interesting, but they lose these armor proficiencies and weapon proficiencies, which I think, so it's interesting. You can't racially inherit an armor proficiency, but you can inherit a tool proficiency. What's with that? So you're just basically born knowing how to use a certain type of tool. So what happens if that, say for example, you're born knowing how to use stonework, but you grew up in a world where there wasn't much stone, you still get born with that ability. It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, dwarves are cool. I love dwarves, and I think you could do a lot with them. I think there's plenty of scope to. I think the extra sub races or lineages will creep back into the game, because dwarves are just one of those standard things that, you know, you can't change them without people like dark dwarves, Dwarga or whatever. They're great. Elves, they're pretty much unchanged. They still get 3 lineages, so High elves, wood elves, and drows are